August 1943. Aboard the cruiser USS San Diego, somewhere in the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Commander James Russell, the ship's chief gunnery officer, stood on the bridge, staring at the radar screen with a growing sense of disbelief. A formation of Japanese bombers was approaching, 12 of them, flying at 15,000 feet. It was a standard attack pattern, a standard altitude, nothing he hadn't seen a dozen times before. Except for one impossible thing. In the past 6 weeks, his gun crews had been achieving hit rates that defied every statistic he had ever learned at Annapolis. Before July, shooting down an enemy aircraft with naval anti-aircraft fire required, on average, over 1,200 heavy shells per kill. The mathematics were brutal. You fired a wall of steel and explosive into the sky, you calculated lead time, you estimated altitude, and you hoped for the best. Most shells exploded uselessly in the empty air. A few came close enough to cause damage. Actual direct hits were so rare they were almost accidental. But since his ship had been rearmed with the new fuses, those mysterious units that had arrived in unmarked crates with strict, almost fanatical security protocols, everything had changed. Now, his crews were averaging 1 aircraft destroyed for every 200 shells fired. Some engagements were even better. Russell didn't understand how the new fuses worked. He'd been told they were classified above top secret, that questions were discouraged, that his job was simply to use them. But he understood results. And the results were impossible. This is the story of one of the most decisive and best-kept secrets of the Second World War. A weapon so revolutionary it would systematically annihilate Japanese air power, a piece of technology so advanced the enemy would never even understand what was killing them. This is the story of the magic shell. If you are fascinated by the secret weapons and forgotten technologies that decided the war, make sure to subscribe to the War Archives and hit the like button to support our mission. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's open the archives. As the Japanese formation drew closer, Russell gave the order, "Commence firing. New ammunition only." The ship's 5-inch guns opened up with a deafening roar. Russell watched through his binoculars. The first salvo of shells screamed into the sky, and then, at what seemed like exactly the right altitude, exactly the right distance from the enemy aircraft, the shells exploded. Not randomly, not scattered across the sky, but in a series of precise, lethal airbursts, creating perfect, black clouds of shrapnel exactly where the enemy planes were flying. The first Japanese bomber caught fire immediately, cartwheeling out of the formation. The second began trailing a thick plume of black smoke. The third broke formation, trying to evade, but the next salvo seemed to anticipate the maneuver. More perfect airbursts, more hits. Within 3 minutes, 6 of the 12 bombers had been destroyed, torn from the sky. The remaining 6 scattered, abandoning their attack run and fleeing for their lives. Russell lowered his binoculars, his hands shaking slightly. In his entire naval career, he had never seen anything like it. Anti-aircraft fire was supposed to be a defensive deterrent, a way to disrupt enemy attacks and, occasionally, get lucky. This wasn't luck. This was an execution. That evening, Russell attended a classified briefing with other gunnery officers from the task force. The room was tense with a mixture of excitement and utter confusion. Every ship that had been equipped with the new fuses was reporting the same, unbelievable results. Hit rates 5 to 6 times higher than with conventional ammunition. Enemy aircraft being destroyed at rates that seemed statistically impossible. The task force commander, Admiral Harold Thompson, stood at the front of the room. "Gentlemen, I know you have questions about the new ordnance. I'm authorized to tell you very little, but you deserve to understand what you're working with." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The fuses you've been issued contain miniature radio transmitters and receivers. They detect their proximity to a target and detonate automatically at the optimal range. No timing calculations are required. No guesswork. The shell itself determines when to explode." The room erupted in murmurs. Russell raised his hand. "Sir, with respect, how is that possible? A radio set would be destroyed by the firing forces. The acceleration alone would shatter any vacuum tubes. The admiral nodded. That was the problem our scientists solved. The details are classified, but yes, they've created vacuum tubes that can survive being fired from a cannon. They've miniaturized radio equipment to fit in a shell casing, and they've done it in such a way that mass production is possible. Another officer spoke up. Sir, if we can do this, can the Japanese? No, Thompson said flatly. Intelligence assessment suggests they're years away from anything comparable, possibly a decade. The manufacturing requirements alone are beyond their current capacity. Thompson continued, what you're witnessing is classified at the highest levels. The enemy must not learn how these fuses work. That's why they're currently restricted to maritime use only. If a dud lands on enemy soil, they could potentially examine it. Russell left the briefing with more questions than answers. But one thing was crystal clear. The war in the Pacific had fundamentally changed, and the Japanese had no idea. Over 1,000 miles away, at the massive Japanese naval airbase in Rabaul, Lieutenant Takashi Yamamoto sat in a debriefing room, his flight suit still soaked with sweat. He had just returned from his third mission against the American task forces in the Solomon Islands. His squadron had started with 18 aircraft. 6 remained operational. The losses themselves weren't surprising. Combat was always dangerous. But the manner of the losses was deeply, terrifyingly troubling. Describe the American anti-aircraft fire, the intelligence officer prompted. Yamamoto struggled to find the words. It's different than before. The shells explode at exactly the right altitude. Not too high, not too low, right where we are flying. You're saying their gun crews have improved their calculations? No, sir, Yamamoto insisted. It's not about calculations. The shells seem to know where we are. They follow us. If we climb, they explode higher. If we dive, they explode lower. The intelligence officer made a few notes, his expression skeptical. Lieutenant, combat stress can create perceptions that, I'm not imagining this. Yamamoto interrupted, his voice sharp. Every pilot who's returned reports the same thing. The Americans have a new weapon, something that makes their anti-aircraft fire far more accurate than before. The intelligence officer closed his notebook. We'll include your observations in the report, but without physical evidence, we can only speculate. Yamamoto knew his report would be dismissed, just like the others. The idea that America had developed some revolutionary technology seemed impossible to the high command. Japan had the better pilots, the better tactics, the superior warrior spirit that the decadent Americans lacked. Technology was supposed to be Japan's advantage, not America's. But Yamamoto had seen his friends die. He had watched their aircraft explode with a precision that conventional anti-aircraft fire simply could not achieve. Something had changed. And whatever it was, Japan had no counter for it. Over the following months, Japanese air operations in the Pacific deteriorated with catastrophic speed. Raid after raid ran into this new, impossibly lethal American defensive fire. Hit rates that had been acceptable, even favorable, suddenly became suicidal. A bombing mission that would previously lose 2 or 3 aircraft, now lost 8 or 10. Attack runs that crews had survived multiple times became one-way death sentences. The Americans had turned the sky into a killing field. By October 1943, Japanese naval aviation had lost over 400 aircraft to American anti-aircraft fire in the Solomon Islands theater alone. The rate of attrition was completely unsustainable. Pilot training couldn't keep pace with the losses. Aircraft production couldn't match the rate of destruction. And most troubling of all, Japanese commanders still couldn't explain why. Some attributed it to improved American training. Others suggested better radar direction. A few mentioned rumors of a new type of shell, but without physical evidence, such speculation was dismissed. Commander Minoru Genda, one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, reviewed the loss reports with growing alarm. The numbers told a story that tactical explanations couldn't account for. American defensive capabilities had increased by a factor that seemed mathematically impossible. "We're missing something," he told his staff. "The Americans have changed something fundamental about their anti-aircraft systems. We need to determine what it is." But determination requires information, and information requires captured equipment. The Americans were fanatically careful. No unexploded shells with the new VT, or variable time proximity fuses, were ever recovered from land battles because the fuses weren't being used over land. They were used only at sea, where any dud would sink to the bottom of the ocean, its secret safe. The secrecy was absolute. And so, Japanese pilots continued to fly into increasingly lethal skies, confused and unprepared for a weapon they didn't understand. What neither Lieutenant Commander Russell nor Lieutenant Yamamoto fully understood was that they were on opposite ends of a fundamental, revolutionary shift in the Pacific War. The VT Proximity Fuze was systematically destroying Japanese naval aviation's offensive capability. The Americans weren't just shooting down more planes, they were changing the strategic calculus of air-sea warfare. Japanese doctrine relied heavily on massed air attacks against American naval forces. The math was simple but brutal. If a raid of 50 aircraft could expect to lose 10 planes, that was acceptable. But if that same raid now lost 30 planes, the equation collapsed. A 60% casualty rate was strategically catastrophic. No air force in the world could sustain such losses. The Japanese commanders didn't have the data to understand this shift. They saw increased losses, but attributed them to various factors: better American pilots, more ships, bad luck. They didn't realize they were fighting a technological revolution. Throughout 1943 and into early 1944, the VT Fuze remained one of the war's best-kept secrets. Japanese intelligence never captured an intact example. They never determined the exact mechanism. Even if they had, they lacked the industrial capacity to implement it. Japan's electronics industry was tiny compared to America's. Their vacuum tube production was limited. Precision manufacturing at that scale was impossible. And that was the fundamental truth. America wasn't just winning through better tactics, it was operating at a different level of technological sophistication. By the time the war ended, American factories had produced over 22 million VT fuses. The Japanese, meanwhile, never produced anything comparable. Not a prototype, not a failed attempt. The gap was absolute. After Japan's surrender, Commander Yamamoto sat in an interrogation room facing American technical intelligence officers. The war was over. Secrecy no longer mattered. The American officer pulled out a VT fuse, setting it on the table between them. "This is what killed so many of your pilots. It's a proximity fuse. Contains a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, and detonates automatically." Yamamoto picked up the fuse, turning it over in his hands. It was smaller than he'd expected. "Unremarkable. How many of these did you produce?" "Over 22 million. The number was incomprehensible. Yamamoto set the fuse down carefully. "We never had a chance, did we? Not against an industrial system that could mass-produce something this sophisticated." "No," the American officer said quietly. "You didn't." Yamamoto thought about all the pilots he'd known, all the skilled aviators who had died. They had fought bravely. They had executed their missions professionally. And they had been slaughtered by a weapon they never understood, produced in quantities they couldn't match, by an enemy whose industrial capacity they had fatally underestimated. "When did you first deploy these?" Yamamoto asked. "Mid-1943, the officer replied. "Once we deployed them in ground combat in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge, the secret was out. But by then, the war's outcome was already certain." The story of the VT Fuze in the Pacific is often overshadowed by more dramatic narratives. But in many ways, it's more significant because it represents the industrial and technological gap that made Japan's defeat inevitable. Japanese pilots in 1943 were flying into a new kind of warfare, one where their skill and courage were increasingly irrelevant against an enemy with a systematic, and secret, technological advantage. Every proximity fuse was a demonstration of American manufacturing capability. And there were millions of them, millions of small, unremarkable devices, each one a miniature marvel of engineering. The Japanese pilots who died in 1943 never knew what killed them. They never understood that they were fighting not just American sailors and pilots, but an entire industrial system operating at a scale and sophistication their nation couldn't match. That ignorance was itself part of their defeat, a defeat written in the sky by shells that knew exactly when to explode.